On a Wednesday morning in the first week of March 2003, Nora Calloway stood at the back door of Calloway Mill and Grain on the south end of Mill Haven, Tennessee, and watched a flatbed truck from a regional distribution company roll past without slowing down. It was the third truck that week. None of them had stopped. The mill had been there since 1954. Nora's father had built it on a patch of gravel off Route 9 with a second-hand stone burr and a lot of optimism, and for 30 years it had been the place that farmers in Hardin County brought their corn and wheat when they wanted it ground the right way. Not the fast way, the right way. Stone ground, slow turned, the kind of meal that kept its germ and its oil and its flavor because the stone didn't heat the grain the way a steel roller did. You either understood the difference or you didn't. Most of the grocery buyers and regional distributors who passed through Mill Haven in 2003 did not. Nora was 53 years old that March, and she had been running the mill for 11 years, since her father's heart had finally told him it was done in 1992. She had not planned to run it. She had spent 8 years in Nashville working for an agricultural extension office, writing crop reports and attending meetings about soil pH and drainage tile, and she had been good at it in the measured, undramatic way that people are good at things they do carefully rather than passionately. When her father got sick, she came home for a week and stayed for the rest of her life. She had not regretted it exactly. But there were mornings, especially mornings like this one, when she stood at the back door and did the arithmetic she had been avoiding, and the arithmetic said that she was running out of time to find a different answer. Let me tell you about what had happened to small stone mills in Tennessee by 2003, because you need to understand what Nora was up against. The industrial roller mills had gotten faster and cheaper through the 1990s. The regional chains had gotten bigger. The grocery buyers who used to drive out to mills like Calloway's and taste the meal and shake a farmer's hand had been replaced by procurement managers who ordered from catalogs and measured quality and shelf life and uniformity. Stone ground meal went rancid faster than roller milled because it kept the oil in the germ. That oil was flavor. It was also a liability in a distribution system built around 60-day freshness, windows, and warehouse storage at ambient temperature. The buyers didn't want flavor. They wanted predictability. Nora had adapted where she could. She had built a small cold storage room off the back of the mill to extend her product's shelf life. She had driven to Nashville twice to meet with specialty food distributors who said they were interested in artisan products and then never returned her calls. She had entered her cornmeal in 2 regional competitions and won both of them, and the ribbons were framed on the wall next to the photograph of her father standing at the original stone burr in 1954, and the ribbons had not brought in a single new wholesale account. She had 6 retail accounts: a natural food store in Savannah, 2 farm stands, a small grocery in Selmer, and 2 restaurants in the county that used her grits on their breakfast menus because their chefs were old enough to remember what grits were supposed to taste like. 6 accounts were not enough to keep the lights on through a slow spring. Her one full-time employee was a man named Harold Boggs, who had worked the mill since her father's time and who knew the stone burrs the way a doctor knows a patient's particular history. He adjusted the gap by sound and by feel, not by gauge. He could tell by the temperature of the meal coming off the stone whether the burrs needed dressing or the feed rate needed adjusting. That knowledge lived in his hands and his ears and nowhere else, and Nora understood it was not replaceable, and she had been paying him out of savings for the past 3 months because the operating accounts wouldn't cover it. That Wednesday morning in March, after the 3rd truck passed without stopping, Nora went back inside and stood at the old wooden counter where her father had weighed out orders for 50 years, and she did the math she'd been avoiding for 2 months. The math said she had maybe 45 days before she'd have to make choices she didn't want to make. Dollars. She was still standing there when the first call came in. Dollars. Let me tell you about that call because this is where the story turns, though it won't look like it's turning yet. Dollars. The call was from a woman named Bet Sorrells, who ran a bed and breakfast out on the old Waynesboro Road. Nora knew Bet slightly, had sold her cornmeal retail for a few years, a 5-pound bag every month or so. Dollars. Bet said she was hosting a cooking retreat the following weekend, 12 women coming in from Nashville and Memphis and Chattanooga. Dollars. And her regular supplier of stone-ground grits had run out of stock and couldn't fill the order in time. Dollars. Could Nora do 20 pounds of coarse grits and 15 pounds of fine meal by Friday? Dollars. Nora said yes. Dollars. It was a small order. It did not solve anything. But Bet Sorrells mentioned something at the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, that lodged in Nora's mind the way a splinter lodges without quite announcing itself. Dollars. She said that 3 of the women coming to the retreat were food writers. One of them wrote for a regional magazine. One ran a cooking blog that Bet describes very popular. Dollars. Though I don't entirely understand how that works. Dollars. Nora filled the order. She drove it out to Bet's on Friday morning. She did not stay. She was not a woman who lingered at the edges of other people's events hoping to be noticed. She left the bags in the kitchen and drove back to the mill and went back to work. Dollars. The call from the food writer came 11 days later. Dollars. Her name was Agatha Finch, and she wrote for a quarterly food journal out of Nashville that Nora had heard of but never read. She said she had used Nora's grits at Bet's retreat and had spent the rest of the weekend thinking about them. She said she wanted to come out and see the mill. She said she had a question she wanted to ask in person. Dollars. Nora told her to come. Dollars. Let me tell you about the mill, because you need to understand what Agatha Finch saw when she walked through the door and why it mattered. Dollars. The mill building was a converted tobacco barn, board and batten, painted red, with a corrugated metal roof that her father had put on in 1968 and that had outlasted 3 predictions of its imminent failure. Inside, the original French Boer millstones were mounted in their wooden vat, the runner stone sitting atop the bedstone the way it had sat since 1954. Dollars. They were each 30 inches across and 8 inches thick, dressed in a furrow pattern that Harold had recut by hand twice in the past decade because the man who used to do it professionally had retired and no one had taken up the work. Dollars. The mill smelled the way old mills smell, which is a smell unlike anything else. Grain dust and stone and wood and the particular warmth of slow mechanical friction. It was not a modern smell. It was not a smell that belonged to 2003. It was a smell that belonged to every decade that had passed through that building since her father first turned the stones. Dollars. Agatha Finch stood in the middle of the mill floor for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "How old are those stones?" Dollars. Nora told her, "French quarried," she said. Her father had bought them from a mill in North Carolina that was closing in 1953. They were old when he bought them. Dollars. Agatha asked how many mills in Tennessee were still running French Boer. Dollars. Nora said she knew of 2, maybe 3 if the one in Humphreys County hadn't closed. Dollars. Agatha wrote something in her notebook. Then she looked up and asked the question she had said she wanted to ask in person. Dollars. She said, "What does this mill do that nobody else can do anymore?" Dollars. Nora was quiet for a moment. Not because she didn't know the answer, because the answer was the kind of thing she had stopped saying out loud, the way you stop saying a thing when you have said it enough times to people who didn't respond to it. Dollars. Then she said, "It grinds cold. The stone runs slow enough that the meal temperature stays below 90 degrees. At 90 degrees, you start losing volatiles, the aromatic compounds that give corn its flavor." Dollars. A roller mill runs hot because it runs fast, and the heat drives off the volatiles before the meal ever hits the bag. When you taste the difference, You're tasting temperature. Dollars. You're tasting what's still there because we never got hot enough to lose it. Dollars. Agatha wrote for a long time. Dollars. Then she said, "Can I come back with a photographer?" Dollars. Let me tell you about what happened after the article ran, because it did not happen the way Nora expected, and the way it did happen is the part of the story worth understanding. Dollars. The article came out in June. It was 4 pages with photographs. It ran under a headline that Nora thought was too dramatic, but she had not been consulted on the headline. It described the mill and the stones and the process and the difference in flavor with the specificity of someone who had done their research and also trusted their own palate. It named Nora. It named Harold. It mentioned the photograph of her father on the wall. What happened next did not happen all at once. A restaurant in Nashville called the week the issue came out. A chef Nora had never heard of, a young man named Corey Aldridge who ran a place in East Nashville that she later learned had been written up in 2 national publications. He said he had been looking for a source for stone-ground grits for 3 years and had not found one he was satisfied with. He wanted to know if she could supply him. Nora said yes. She quoted him a price that was honest and not cheap. He said, "That's fine." A second restaurant called the following week, a third the week after. But here is where the story gets complicated. And here is where you need to understand something that Nora herself did not fully understand until Harold explained it to her one evening while they were both staying late to bag a large order. The restaurants were not the thing that saved the mill. The restaurants were the signal that reached the person who saved it. Let me tell you about Patsy Drummond, because she is the reason Calloway Mill and Grain is still operating today and the reason Nora's daughter runs it now. Patsy Drummond was 61 years old and had spent 30 years running the purchasing department for a regional grocery chain called Cumberland Foods, which operated 22 stores across Tennessee and northern Alabama and southern Kentucky. She was not a woman who read food journals as a rule. But her daughter had left a copy of the issue with Nora's article on Patsy's kitchen counter after a visit, and Patsy had read it the way she read everything related to her work, which was carefully and without sentiment and with a specific question in mind. The question was always the same. Is this something my customers actually want, or is this something that food writers want my customers to want? Patsy had been in purchasing long enough to know the difference. She had seen trends that lasted and trends that didn't. She had passed on plenty of artisan products that food writers loved and customers bought once and didn't repurchase. She had also missed a few things she wished she hadn't, and those were the ones she thought about. She read the article, then she drove to East Nashville and ate dinner at Corey Aldridge's restaurant and ordered the grits. She ate them and sat with it for a minute. Then she asked the server where the grits came from. The server told her about Calloway Mill. Patsy Drummond drove to Millhaven the following Thursday. Let me tell you about what she saw, because it matters to understand what she decided. She arrived without calling ahead. Nora was in the mill when she pulled into the gravel lot, running a batch of fine meal for one of the Nashville accounts. Harold was dressing the stones, which he did at the end of every run, a process that involved a specific hammer and a specific pattern that he had learned from Nora's father and that he had never written down because he said the writing of it would not capture the part that mattered. Patsy Drummond stood in the mill doorway and watched for several minutes before Nora noticed her. When Nora came over, Patsy introduced herself and said she was from Cumberland Foods, and she was interested in understanding what the mill could and couldn't do at scale. Nora looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "How much scale are we talking about?" Patsy said, "Start with what you can actually do. We'll talk about what I need after." They talked for 2 hours. Nora showed her the stones, the cold storage, the bagging operation, the dressing tools Harold used. She explained the temperature constraint, the shelf life, dollars, the distribution requirements that were and weren't compatible with her process. She did not oversell. She did not tell Patsy what she thought Patsy wanted to hear. She told her what was true and what wasn't, dollars, and she said plainly which things she could guarantee and which she couldn't, dollars. Patsy Drummond had been in purchasing for 30 years. She had sat across from 1,000 salespeople. She said later to her daughter that what she remembered most about that conversation was that Nora Calloway had not tried to sell her anything. At the end of the 2 hours, Patsy said, "I want to put your meal and your grits in 12 stores, the ones with customers who cook, not the urban flagship stores, the smaller ones in county seats in towns like this one, where people remember what this is supposed to taste like." Nora said, "I can do 12 stores." Patsy said, "I'll need you to hold the price for 18 months while we see how it moves." Nora said she could do that. Patsy said, "One more thing. I'm going to need you to be honest with me if you hit a wall. If the stones go down, if your capacity changes, if something happens that means you can't fill the orders. I'd rather know early than find an empty shelf." Nora said, "I've been honest with you for 2 hours. I don't plan to stop." Patsy Drummond looked at her for a moment. Then she smiled, the small, precise smile of a woman who had been doing her job long enough to recognize something real when she saw it. She shook Nora's hand and drove back toward Nashville. Let me tell you about what happened to Calloway Mill that summer and fall, because the saving did not come all at once, and it did not come without difficulty. The Cumberland Foods account went live in July, all 12 stores. Nora had to bring in a second part-time employee to handle the increase in volume. She had to recalibrate the feed rate on the stones to maintain temperature under longer continuous runs. Harold adjusted the burr gap by a quarter turn, and then another eighth after the first week of the new volume, and the temperature held. The 12 stores sold through their first orders faster than Patsy had projected. She added 4 more stores in September. She called Nora before adding them, not to ask permission, but to make sure Nora could handle it without compromising the product. Nora said she could. She could, but only because of something in the back corner of the mill building that most people who visited never asked about. Let me tell you about the back corner of the Calloway Mill, because it is the reason this story is still worth telling 20 years later. Her father had been a man who kept things. Not out of sentiment, though sentiment was part of it, out of the understanding that the right tool, once gone, is very difficult to replace. In the back corner of the mill, behind the bagging station and the cold storage room, there was a second set of millstones, smaller than the French bourre stones in the main vat, 24 inches across, not $30. They were quarried granite, not French bourre, which meant they were harder and dressed differently and produced a coarser grind that the French stones didn't replicate exactly. Her father had bought them in 1971 from a mill in Georgia that was converting to rollers. He had paid $200 for them and installed them on a secondary drive shaft off the main power takeoff, and he had used them for 30 years for coarse grinding, for animal feed, for special orders that required a texture the French stones weren't designed to produce. When Nora took over, she had kept the secondary stones running because Harold said they should be run regularly or the dressing would set wrong. She had used them occasionally for specialty orders, for a restaurant that wanted a particular coarse grind for a polenta-style dish. Most people who came through the mill walked past the secondary vat without looking at it. It sat in the back corner under a canvas tarp between runs. When the Cumberland volume increased in September, Nora moved the secondary stones into regular rotation. The coarser grind that came off the granite produced a product that two of the Cumberland chefs said was different from anything else they had found. A grind with a particular texture and a particular way of holding butter that the French boer grits didn't match exactly. Patsy Drummond called her in October. She said two of her store managers in rural Kentucky had been asking if Cumberland carried anything like what their grandmothers used to buy from a mill. A coarser meal, speckled with the hull, not the uniform yellow of the standard stone ground product. Nora said, I can do that. I've been doing it on the secondary stones. Patsy said, how long have you had those? Nora said, my father bought them in 1971. Patsy said nothing for a moment, then she said, I want to run it as a second SQ, Callaway Mill Heirloom Grind. Can you supply enough? Nora said she could. She was right. By December of 2003, Callaway Mill and Grain had 2 Cumberland Foods SKUs in 16 stores, a direct account with 4 restaurants, and a retail mail order list that had grown from the article response. Harold had taken on a second part-time apprentice, a young man from the county agricultural program who had asked, after his first day watching Harold dress the stones, whether this was something you could learn from a book. Harold said no. The young man said he'd like to learn anyway. Harold looked at him for a moment and then showed him the hammer. Let me tell you about the conversation Nora had with her daughter Lily. Because Lily is the one who runs the mill today, and Lily is the one who keeps the stones dressed, and the temperature holding in the corner of the room clean around the secondary vat. Lily was 19 in 2003. She was in her second year at UT Knoxville, studying agricultural economics, which her mother had quietly encouraged because it seemed like a path that led somewhere other than the mill. Nora had not wanted her daughter to feel obligated. She had made a point, when Lily was growing up, of never framing the mill as a legacy to be inherited. It was a business. It had its own logic. If it made sense for Lily to come back to it, she would come back. If it didn't, she wouldn't. Lily came home for Christmas in 2003 and spent 3 days in the mill helping with the December orders. On the last evening before she drove back to Knoxville, she and Nora sat at the wooden counter, and Nora told her what had happened that year. Not as an invitation, just as what it was, a year that had nearly ended the mill and then hadn't, and the reason it hadn't. Lily asked about the secondary stones. She asked why her grandfather had kept them. Nora said she had Harold the same question once. Harold had said that her father used to say, you keep the thing that does the job the new thing can't do, and you keep it running whether or not anyone is asking for it, because the day they ask for it is not the day to find out if it still works. He never told you that himself? Nora said he had, but not in those words. He had told it to her the way her father told most things, by doing it in front of her and expecting her to understand. Lily was quiet for a while. Did you ever almost sell the secondary stones? Nora said yes. In 1998, when things were slow and she was looking for anything to liquidate, she had called a millstone broker in Virginia and asked what she could get for a set of 24-inch granite burrs in fair condition. The broker had said $300 maybe, if he found a buyer, which wasn't guaranteed. Nora had not sold them. She said she wasn't sure exactly why she hadn't. Part of it was the $300, part of it was that Harold had asked her not to, in the quiet way Harold asked for things, which was by saying them once and then not saying them again. Part of it was that she had stood there looking at them under the tarp and thought about the man who had bought them in 1971 for $200, and she had not been able to bring herself to undo what he had done on the grounds that she couldn't see a use for it at the time. Lily said, I'm glad you didn't. Nora, so am I. Lily came back to the mill after graduation. She took over the operations side in 2007 and has run it since. She expanded the cold storage in 2011. She added a third set of stones in 2015, small ones, for experimental grain varieties that a cluster of heritage grain farmers in the region had started growing and needed someone to mill. She went to Nashville once to meet with a food technology company that wanted to discuss a partnership involving modernizing the grind process, and she listened to their presentation, and she thanked them, and she drove home and adjusted the feed rate on the French burr stones and said nothing more about it. The secondary granite stones are still in the back corner of the mill. They are not under a tarp anymore. Lily had the secondary vat rebuilt in 2009, new wooden housing on the original iron frame, and she runs the stones twice a week at minimum to keep them in condition. The heirloom grind that Patsy Drummond named in 2003 is still a Cumberland Foods SKU. It is in 31 stores now. It is not the mill's biggest seller, but it is the one that new accounts ask about first, the one that food writers mention by name, the one that people drive to the mill specifically to buy. The photograph on the counter at Calloway Mill shows a man standing at the French burr stones on what looks like an autumn morning in the 1960s. He is wearing a canvas apron and his hands are white with meal, and he is looking at the stones the way a man looks at something he understands completely. Beside him on the wooden floor, visible in the corner of the frame, there is a set of smaller stones leaning against the wall, not yet installed, newly arrived. People who come into the mill ask about the photographs sometimes. Lily tells them the story. She tells it the way her mother told it to her, not as a story about old technology surviving into a modern world, because that is not what it is. She tells it as a story about a man who understood that the value of a thing is not determined by whether someone currently needs it, and that the surest way to be without the right tool when the moment comes is to have decided in a quieter moment that you didn't need it anymore. The French burr stones her grandfather bought in North Carolina in 1953 are still the heart of the mill. They will outlast everyone who has ever touched them. The granite stones in the corner will outlast everything else. Lily makes sure of that. She dresses them herself now, the way Harold taught her, with the specific hammer and the specific pattern, the knowledge that lives in the hands and the ears and nowhere else, passed from her grandfather to Harold to her, without ever having been written down and without ever having needed to be. I think about Nora Calloway standing at that back door in March, watching the third truck roll past without slowing down, and I think about how close she came to selling those granite stones for $300. That's what it almost cost. There's a kind of cause and effect that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a clear label that says, "This decision matters, pay attention." It arrives quietly, the way Harold asked her not to sell the stones, once, without pressing, without drama. And then it waits, for years sometimes, for a decade. It waits until the morning someone calls with a problem that only that exact thing can solve, and then everything that followed from the decision to keep it, or to let it go, becomes visible all at once. I've been thinking about what it actually takes to hold on to something when you can't yet see the use for it. It's not just patience. Patience is passive. What Nora had was something more active than that. She understood the value of what she had, even when no one else was asking for it. That's a kind of intelligence that has nothing to do with degrees or spreadsheets. It's the intelligence of knowing what a thing actually is and what it actually does, and refusing to let someone else's indifference redefine it for you. Her father had it too. He bought those secondary stones in 1971 for $200 because he understood them. He installed them and ran them and kept them dressed, not because there was a market for what they produced, but because he knew the day would come when there was, and he wanted to be ready. That's not luck. Dollars. That's a man who did the work of understanding his craft deeply enough to see around corners that other people couldn't see around. Dollars. And then there's the part of this story that I find hardest to put into words, which is what Nora did when Patsy Drummond walked through the door. She didn't oversell. She didn't tell Patsy what she thought Patsy wanted to hear. She said what was true and what wasn't, and she said plainly what she could guarantee and what she couldn't. Dollars. After years of watching accounts walk out the door, after months of drawing down her savings to make payroll, she sat across from the person who could save her business, and she told her the honest limits of what she could do. Dollars. That took something. I don't think it's dramatic to say that. It took a kind of integrity that is genuinely difficult when you are 45 days from making choices you don't want to make. The temptation to round up, to promise us a little more than you know you can deliver, to be whatever the buyer needs you to be in that moment. That temptation is real. Nora didn't take it. Dollars. And Patsy Drummond, who had been in purchasing for 30 years and had sat across from 1,000 salespeople, recognized it immediately. Dollars. What I take from this story is something I keep coming back to in my own life. The things that end up mattering most are usually the things that required all three of those qualities at once. The honesty to say what's true even when it costs you. The understanding to know what you have before anyone else does, and the steadiness to keep it running when no one is asking for it yet. Dollars. Nora had all three, so did her father. And now Lily dresses those granite stones herself with the hammer Harold put in her hands, passing forward the same knowledge that was never written down because the part that matters can't be. Dollars. The stones that nobody wanted are in 31 stores now. Dollars, they were always going to be.